All right, so it looks like we have about the same number of people that we had here on Monday, so I'm going to take that as a good sign. So welcome to day 2. Thank you very much for being here on day 1. We had a really productive day with a lot of content shared. You got an overview of our division and our office at the Department of Labor. We talked a lot about programmatic and fiscal compliance, and we finished up the day with a session for all of you who have NEDP funding. So today, just as a brief overview, session number 1 right now is going to include assessment information and data information. At 10:45, we will join back together. We will talk about instructional topics. And then like on Monday, paralleling Monday, we will meet back here at 12 o'clock if you have IELCE, IET funding. So I just want to make one comment as we get started this morning. The assessment and the data pieces are very critical to the COVID-19 situation. But what I want you to do and what I want us to do during this session is to keep the bigger picture in mind as well. I personally have hope that we will move beyond COVID-19 at some point. In fact, if we move into 2021, then we might have to change the name. So we'll see. But let's try to keep a big picture perspective. We will go ahead and take questions. We'll try to do that between sessions, or between sections of the session. So please go ahead and put those in the chat box, and then we will get to them at the natural breaks in the content. So with that, I'm going to turn us over to Helen, and she's going to talk about the assessment policy.
Okay, I just want to begin briefly talking about the National Reporting System, which was established in partnership with Octave to ensure that we are reporting learner outcomes systematically across the states. The NRS is the accountability system for Title II funded programs. And our primary performance measure, as we know, is completion or progress within an EFL. And that's determined by pre-testing and post-testing in comparing the results. And to make sure that our data is good, reliable, and valid, programs have to use the standardized NRS-approved assessments and also to administer tests using consistent practices. The Department of Education requires states to have a written assessment policy to ensure that these practices are put into place. And states must include specific components and submit the policy for review and approval annually. Maryland's assessment policy, and I can see the next slide, please, is the Basic Skills in English Language Assessment Policy. This is a policy that applies to assessment practices for both Title I and Title II providers. Maryland was concerned that our programs be aligned and ensure that services for co-enrolled participants are seamless. In the past, sometimes students were given one assessment at the workforce and another when they were referred to adult ed, which resulted in over-testing for the same purposes. We want to be sure that we're doing things the same way so that we are confident that we can share assessment results and be getting the same information for co-enrolled participants. These are the Maryland state approved assessments. The ABE assessments, CASAS reading goals, math goals, and Table 11 and 12 are aligned with the college and career readiness standards and do have more rigor than the previous assessments that they replaced. They take a little bit longer to administer, but they are CCRS aligned. The ESL assessments are due to expire in February of 2021. The publishers have submitted, in many cases, to Octave their revised testing, and until Octave gives us the green light to approve them, we're just waiting, and we don't know when that will be. The NRS publishes approved tests, and any changes to tests that are approved are expiring in the Federal Register. So when we receive that and get word that a new test has been approved, we will certainly notify you of that. I want to talk a little bit about the intake and assessment specialist. That is your team member who has the primary responsibility for the assessment process. Your IAS is responsible for ensuring that all the staff who administer assessments are trained, and that would include training on the assessment policy. We really recommend that all of your team understand what's in the assessment policy, but also that they understand the test administration procedures and anything that the publisher requires, and data collection processes. The IAS usually works in collaboration with the MIS on data. Orientation, intake, and assessment is usually coordinated through the IAS, although we know that your team probably is very involved in that. Our state requires that 100% of students be pre-tested prior to the commencement of instruction. There is some confusion on that because we used to have it before 12 hours of, or after 12 hours of instruction, or no later than 12 hours. But it is before instruction is given at all. 70% of students must be post-tested during the grant cycle. We recommend that your students receive 70 to 100 hours of instruction between pre and post-test, but as it says here, they must have at least a minimum of 40 hours between the pre and post-test. The IAS is also responsible for ensuring that student information and all testing materials are secured, and that data is collected using consistent and standardized processes using our standardized tests under standardized testing conditions. Records for assessment need to be maintained for 3 years from the submission of the final report. And here we get into the COVID part. OCTAE has provided some flexibility for states to ensure that services can continue through the COVID pandemic and the subsequent closures. They allowed for the introduction of remote test proctoring, provided these 3 conditions are met. The student who is testing must be properly identified, and that would involve a picture ID. Tests can be properly secured. For this reason, you can't do remote testing with paper tests. It can only be e-tests. And the virtual proctor can properly administer the test. The proctor must understand how to administer e-tests and also be familiar with the web conferencing platform that they're using to do the remote proctoring. Programs are advised to track students who are unable to test, and Doug has provided processes for this to your MIS. We just want to make sure, because we know that remote testing isn't going to reach every student. In fact, it'll probably reach just a few. Students have to have certain things in place, as well as the test administrators. So we know that there are going to be many of your students who aren't currently able to be tested, but we do need to make sure that you track those so that we can be able to track the impact of COVID-19. We issued our guidance for remote testing on May 20th. Just to be sure if there's any confusion, we are okay with you going ahead and doing this. I think at the time the guidance came out, CASAS was still in the piloting phase, but you should know that they are no longer piloting. You may go ahead and do it. Programs who do it must follow the guidelines, and I will tell you both TABE and CASAS have really published some very extensive guidelines to help you with that. We must be sure that your proctors, as I said, are trained in e-testing, and there are a lot of moving pieces there, so be sure that you're comfortable with that piece before you go on to the remote testing. Proctors and students also need to have the technology, and the technology is listed in the guidelines for each of the test publishers. So if you look through that, you'll know what you need. There are some differences between TABE and CASAS and also BEST, and you need to follow whatever that particular assessment would be. At the minimum, you would need to have a computer, I think typically Windows 10, a web conferencing platform, and enough bandwidth to be able to do this. But again, there's more information in the guidelines and also with the test publishers. I'll stop now. Is there anything that I can answer for anyone?
Thank you, Helen. Let's give
Okay,
a couple of
thanks.
minutes to see if anyone has any questions in the chat box. If not, you can feel free to ask them as we move into the next section, and we will address them closer to the end of the session. Emma Wilson, does anyone know when CASAS will release the goal series?
For ESL, no, we don't at this point. We know that the tests are due to expire February of 21 and sunset in June of 21, but we have not received any information about when that will happen. In fact, we never know when that's going to happen until we get the notification from OPTEC.
So Emma's question, she actually clarified it for remote testing of ABE.
It's available now. If you go to the CASAS website, you'll see that they have the proctoring, remote proctor training, and they have the agency agreements, and you may go ahead and proceed with those steps and go ahead and do it.
And then it looks like an unknown person is asking in the chat box, what is the cost of CASAS e-testing? And thank you, Dawn. Dawn answered the question. E-CASAS units are based on quantity. She pays $2.20 a unit with a $15 fee. Dawn, is the $15 fee like the cost of making the order? Like every order comes with a $15 fee? Yeah, the fee is for the order. Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, Dawn.
I also just wanted to say that we are in the process of revising the assessment policy. No need to print it out. A new one will be coming. Ellen sent everyone a copy of the policy to review. It's out for comment now, so if you have any comments to make, please include them. What you won't see there is the procedural manual, which is just a placeholder in the current policy that's out for comment. And the manual is really the nuts and bolts for Title II and for test administrators. It gives the processes for each assessment.
Anyone know if the CASAS fees per test is for NEDP diagnostic tests? That is a good question. Probably one for bio. So let me jot that question down. And who is the unknown person in the chat box so that I can get back to you? Ronnie, okay. All right, Ronnie, I'll have bio reach back out to you regarding the CASAS fees per test.
There's a question from Jesse as to whether we can use the state AFLA funds to purchase tests. Yes, it's supplies and materials of instruction. Well, actually, assessment materials, but it is something you can legitimately purchase with our funds.
All right, well, thank you for those questions. Let's go ahead and move. We're going to introduce Doug and our next section of LACES.
Good morning, everyone. This is Doug Weimer. I'm going to pick up with a little bit of information about LACES and some deadlines and the data flow in the state of Maryland. So first of all, if you're not familiar, LACES stands for the Literacy Adult and Community Education System. It is a vendor product. It's owned by Literacy Pro Systems. It's used by about 26 states and territories across the country right now. Prior to this, we did have an in-house system called LWIS. And I only bring that up because you may still see the term LWIS on the labor website. case you're wondering, it's a Literacy Works information system, but we are now on the LACES system. We have been for several years. The LACES system is the database for all of our adult literacy information in Maryland. It includes student demographic information, all of the information on our assessments, student attendance information. It marks all of the completions and measurable skills gains, as well as produces the NRS tables. The NRS tables are something that we need from you so that we can track your local progress, but also it's how we report our outcomes to the federal government, to Octane. LACES deadlines. As I mentioned on Monday, data for LACES has to be entered at the minimum at least monthly. Many programs do this more frequently than that, but especially for a large program, if that's a challenge, you have to make sure that anything that happens is entered at least within a month of it's happening. That would be student registration, assessment data, etc. We also expect that data is updated by quarterly reporting periods. In this previous grant cycle, we have switched to a trimester reporting, but starting with this grant cycle, we're going back to quarterly reporting. And so that means that by every quarter, you have entered information by that deadline so that you can produce an NRS table that is an accurate representation of your program for that quarter. So quarter one would end on September 30th, and we require that you have everything entered by October 15th. So that allows you 2 extra weeks after the end of that quarter to enter information. December 31st is the end of quarter 2. You have to enter that by January 15th. March 31st is the end of quarter 3. You must enter everything by April 15th. And then the end of quarter 4, which of course is the end of the fiscal year, ends on June 30th. And the entry date for that is always to be determined. It's usually around the end of July, but we make that determination as we get closer to that time when we see how much time everyone needs to enter that information, because there's a lot of cleanup and a lot of queries that are done at the end of the year, so we allow you additional time. Now, part of the reason why we require that everything be entered at least monthly and that we have these quarterly reporting periods is we want to make sure that our data is current. We can't use the data system to get a snapshot of your program if your program information is not kept up to date. In addition, while I'm not going to go into that on this particular webinar, but I will probably be doing more trainings on this throughout the year, keeping your data current avoids you generating additional periods of participation, or POPs as we call them. So this means that a student will generate a second POP if there's more than a 90-day gap in their instruction. If your data is kept current, then you can identify those students that might be on the cusp of generating an additional POP and hopefully work to bring those students back into your program. Now, with these quarterly reporting deadlines, we want to stress that you do not need to plan your class schedule around these deadlines, meaning even meaning that you do not need to make sure that your classes start and end within those quarters. Do what works for your program. So you don't have to have classes end by December 31st or classes end by March 31st. The only deadline when it comes to the succession of your classes is, of course, you have to have classes end by the end of the fiscal year. You can't have a class that crosses over to June 30th. But other than that, you run the schedule with what makes sense for your program and for your students. We just ask that you have the data updated by these particular deadlines. A little bit about the data flow. So we have 25 local grantees this year in the state of Maryland, and that information is entered by you at least monthly. That information then comes to us at the state office. At the state office at Maryland Labor, we can use this data for desk monitoring, error checking, and also for reporting out on our state and local performance. That information then flows up to Octane at the federal level, which monitors all state performance and reports out at the federal level. They also, of course, compare us to other states to see how we're doing and makes adjustments or recommendations on what our outcomes need to be in future years. So that's the way the data flows. It flows from the local programs up through us to the federal government. Now, what is the point of collecting all this information? Of course, it's because we're trying to measure your program effectiveness. So just some brief definitions. And once again, I'm sure I'll do some training on this in more depth later on, but it's just to give you an overview. A measurable skill gain is a major indicator of success for our programs. And you achieve a measurable skill gain in the state of Maryland one of two ways, either by making an educational functioning level gain or obtaining a high school diploma. a student makes an educational functioning level gain, or an EFL, whenever they pre and post test and go up one level. So for example, if you have a student that tests into AB level 2, and during the course of the fiscal year they post test and make it to AB level 3, that's an educational functioning level gain. That also then counts as a measurable skill gain. Another way that you can get the MSG, of course, is through the high school diploma. You can obtain the high school diploma either through the completion of GED tests or through the completion of the National External Diploma Program. While MSGs are not the only way that program effectiveness is measured, it is the major indicator of success, and it is the one that we put the most emphasis on. Other measures, though, that are important are the post-test rate. As Helen mentioned earlier, it is the expectation that 70% of all students have a pre-post-test match during the fiscal year. The post-test rate is easy to calculate. It's just the number of students that are post-tested out of the number of students that achieve 12 or more hours. That achieving 12 or more hours is something that Octave allows us. Octave understands that you have students that will come to registration, come to orientation, but then maybe never come back to the program again. While we want you to work to bring those students back, we understand that with adult literacy programs, there's always going to be a handful of students that go through the intake process but don't actually participate. Those students don't count for or against our outcomes. But once a student does have 12 or more hours of contact within a fiscal year, then they do count for your outcomes. So once a student has 12 or more hours, if a student drops out of your program, it is the expectation that you will work to try to get those students back into your program to get additional contact hours and hopefully make a measurable skills gain. Other outcomes that are measured are median wages and employment. These are common WIOA reporting measures across all of the titles. The median wages and employment is something that is done at the state level. We use a data match with the Maryland Longitudinal Data System Center to match that data. So it's not something that you are responsible for reporting, other than you do need to, of course, collect on intake what the student's employment status is upon intake. Other than that, we are able to do a data match with MLDS to report on what those median wages are after exit, as well as the student's employment after exit. And in addition, you also need to be cognizant of any certifications that your students obtain, and if the students enter post-secondary education or training. Those are also measures that we expect that you will monitor for the students. Something else that's not on this list that I just wanted to mention briefly is that at the beginning of the fiscal year, I am going to be working with all of the programs to make sure that I have a correct list of who should have access to LACES for your program. Usually the program administrator and the MIS have full access, but it is up to the local program administrator as to who else has access to LACES in your local program. Some programs have their entire leadership team have read-only access, and some programs keep that to the program administrator and the MIS. So I'll be reviewing that list with you as we get close to the beginning of the fiscal year. One, because I want to make sure it's correct and we don't have anyone sitting in the system that no longer needs access, but also because I'll have you complete your certification of access, as I mentioned on Monday, that will keep us in line with our data security policy. And that is all I have. Let's see if we have any questions. Any questions from anyone?
So any questions about assessment or data at this point? So Don is asking clarification on the median wage employment. Will that be tracked at the state level?
Yes. So your expectation is that when you do upon intake, you ask the student if they're employed, full-time, part-time, unemployed, etc. That needs to be put in by your MIS on intake, but the rest of the measures for employment will be done on my end. Unfortunately, I'm not able to give you that information at a local level, but we do that data match at the state level so that then we can report that out to Octave. So you do not have any requirements to track students down and determine their employment status later on. Now, if you know that status, I encourage you to put that in, but it's not a requirement. We handle that at the state level.
And then Dawn is also asking, entering post-secondary career training, will that be the responsibility of the program?
Yes, at this point, I do not have a method to do that at the state level. I'm still working towards that. And if I get that, I'll let you know. But if you know that information, I do ask that you put that in for the students. And let's see, I see Daryl says program will only get EFL for 1 and not 2 math reading. Good question. So the program will only get, I'd rather, instead of saying EFL, I'd rather say MSG. A program can only get a measurable skill gain once per student per period of participation. So if a student is with you the entire fiscal year continuously, that's 1 period of participation. If they make 3 level gains during that year, that's awesome. And the 3 level gains will be in LACES. However, you only get 1 completion from that student. The only exception to that would be if the student makes a level gain, say in the fall, has a 90-day or more gap with your program, comes back after that gap, and then makes another gain. In that situation, you would get 2 measurable skill gains from that 1 student. That doesn't happen very often. It does happen, but it doesn't happen very often. It's definitely not something you should plan for. So work with your students. Once they get an MSG, encourage them to continue, but you will not get a second MSG from them that fiscal year. But if they continue into the next fiscal year, then of course you can get another MSG in the following fiscal year.
All right, great questions. We'll give it another minute or so. You have questions either for Helen on assessment or Doug on data. And Bio is chiming in. Thanks, Bio. CASAS confirms that the fee per e-test is for a reading or math goals test, which are the NEDP diagnostic tests. So Ronnie, does that help clarify?
I'm still concerned about it's now going to cost more for NEDP. So it's just a discussion maybe I can have with Bio offline.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Ronnie, can you come back on? Dawn is asking what exactly you're asking about with NEDP.
Okay. If we have to do e-tests and we pay for e-tests, once we get set up to do that, and I know years ago we did that back when it was about $1 a test. But anyway, the diagnostics, if we have to do them remotely and we have to use e-tests, then even though we've opened up a unit with CASAS, if we're doing it remotely and we have to use e-tests, it's another $2 plus per test. That's my concern. Does that help?
So both Dawn and Melanie are commenting. So Dawn says that they've been doing it for years and it really hasn't added much of a difference to the cost. And then Melanie is saying that they currently use CASAS e-tests for diagnostics and it does not add any more cost.
Well, it depends on what you need to get back. I'm talking about a program that's only NEDP, and we're already charging as much as we're allowed to charge. And plus the fact that if somebody has to be pre-tested, screened, whatever you call it in terms of intake, and you have to use that, it's going to cost you to do reading and math as an e-test in addition. So I'm seeing the dollar signs.
Okay, so since this is pretty NEDP specific and we have about 47 people on the call, why don't we circle back to this? But yes, I mean, e-testing is going to be more expensive than buying a paper test and giving it to 20 people. So let's circle back to this, and we can include bio in that conversation. It looks like from your colleagues that they're not seeing that great of a difference, so we can have a conversation about that around NETP.
Great, thank you.
Sure. All right, everyone. Well, it seems like we have finished up in record time with our session number 1. So let's conclude this session, and we will see all of you back here at 10:45 for instructional topics. Thank you.